The police chief's hands trembled as he flipped through the file left on his desk. Inside were secrets he thought had been buried forever. Evidence of corruption, lies, and the sins of an entire department laid bare in black and white. And attached to the last page, a single handwritten note: leave. That was the moment Chief Rollins realized the war was over before it even began. Officer Gregson had already vanished without a trace, his car abandoned on the side of the road, his fate unknown. The rest of the force was crumbling under the weight of fear, their own paranoia turning them into ghosts of themselves. And the man behind it all? A quiet, forgotten veteran named John Callahan. They thought he was just an old man. They thought they could take from him without consequence. But they never knew who he really was. Tonight, the past comes knocking, and no one in Redford is ready for what's coming. Before we continue with the story, tell us what country you're watching from. If you like this story, hit the subscribe button, because tomorrow we have a new special story for you. John Reaper Callahan had lived in the quiet town of Redford for nearly 2 decades, a man of few words and fewer attachments, save for the one that mattered most, his dog Shadow. The black German shepherd had been more than just a pet. He was John's last tether to a world that had long since left him behind, a companion who understood the weight of silence, the ghost that still lurked in the corners of his mind. Shadow had been trained for discipline, loyalty, and protection, the only living thing that had walked beside John through the restless nights and the memories that clawed their way out of the past. The town knew John as the quiet old man who fixed his own roof, kept his lawn immaculate, and never caused trouble. But those who paid closer attention would notice the sharpness in his eyes, the way he carried himself. Not like an old man worn by time, but like a blade sheathed, waiting. Still, most of Redford simply let him be, and he asked for nothing in return. That was how he wanted it. That was how it should have stayed. But on an autumn evening, under the dull glow of the streetlights, fate intervened in the cruelest of ways. John had taken Shadow out for his usual evening walk, the crisp air filling his lungs, the weight of the leash firm in his calloused hand, when a police cruiser slowed beside him. He had noticed the department's presence increasing in the area lately, a shift in leadership bringing in younger, eager officers looking to prove themselves in a town that didn't need proving to. He barely spared the car a glance until the spotlight flicked on, washing over him in shadow in a blinding flash. A voice, sharp and unfamiliar, barked out, demanding he stop. John, used to authority but no longer beholden to it, simply turned his head, meeting the eyes of a young officer stepping out of the car, his hand already resting on his service weapon. Officer Gregson was fresh out of the academy, full of the kind of misguided confidence that came with a badge and a gun, but not enough experience to understand either. To him, the old man with the large, muscular dog looked like a problem waiting to happen. "Control your dog," Gregson shouted, stepping forward, his pulse quickening as he saw the beast's eyes reflecting in the light. John tightened the leash instinctively, his stance calm, measured. "He's controlled," he replied, his voice low, unreadable. But Gregson didn't hear it, didn't process it. All he saw was the way Shadow moved slightly in front of the man, the way its ears perked up in alertness, the way its muscles tensed, not in aggression, but in readiness. And in that split second, Gregson's inexperience and fear made a decision his brain barely had time to process. The gunshot cracked through the night like a whip, the deafening sound sending birds into the sky and shattering the delicate stillness of Redford suburban street. Shadow jerked violently, a sharp yelp torn from his throat as his legs crumpled beneath him, the leash slipping from John's fingers as the weight of his closest friend collapsed against the pavement. For a moment, the world stood still. Gregson's breath hitched, his hands shaking as he realized what he had done. But there was no taking it back, no pulling the bullet from where it had torn through Shadow's chest. John dropped to his knees beside the dog, his hands trembling, not in fear, not in shock, but in something deeper, something far more dangerous. Shadow's dark eyes, the ones that had never once left John's side, stared up at him, the light in them fading, his breath slowing, and then nothing. Just silence. Just loss. Gregson took a half step back, suddenly aware that he had done something irreversible, that the old man now kneeling beside the lifeless body of his only friend was no ordinary civilian. The way John's fingers curled into fists, the way his shoulders squared, the way his head lifted ever so slightly, his eyes locking onto Gregson with an intensity that cut deeper than any blade. Something inside the young officer told him he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The world around them felt different now, the air thick with something unseen, something dark, something that made Gregson's stomach twist in a way that no training had prepared him for. John rose slowly, his movements deliberate, controlled, as if he were holding something back, something barely contained beneath the surface. "You just killed my dog," he said, and the way the words left his mouth wasn't a statement of grief, it was a death sentence. The other officer, still in the cruiser, had stepped out now, sensing the shift in the air, the silent war that had just begun in that single moment. "Sir, it was a mistake," the second officer, Davis, said cautiously, his voice steadier than Gregson's, though the doubt in his eyes betrayed him. "We thought you didn't think," John cut in, his voice sharper than a knife's edge. "That was your first mistake." His eyes never left Gregson, the young officer standing rigid, his knuckles white around the grip of his gun, though he didn't raise it again. He wouldn't dare. "It's a tragic accident," Davis insisted, trying to reel the situation back, trying to de-escalate the firestorm they had unknowingly ignited. "We'll file a report, get everything sorted." "Sorted?" John echoed, his tone hollow. He looked down at Shadow, his blood staining the concrete, soaking into the cracks, an irreversible wound not just on the pavement, but on John himself. Something inside him fractured, but it wasn't the grief that broke him. It was the realization that these men with badges and authority, would walk away from this without consequence, without accountability. The law had taken from him before, had sent him to war, had left him to rot in the aftermath, and now, all these years later, it had come again, taking the last piece of his soul without a second thought. The second mistake they made was thinking this was over. It wasn't. Not by a long shot. Gregson shifted his stance, opening his mouth to speak, but John was already turning away, his fingers grazing the cold fur of his fallen companion one last time before he rose fully, his expression unreadable. "You'll answer for this," John said, not as a threat, but as a promise. Then he walked away, leaving Shadow's body where it lay, knowing there was only one path forward now. And just like that, the war he had buried decades ago began anew. The town of Redford had always been a place where people preferred to let sleeping dogs lie, where the past was left buried, and old men were just old men, nothing more. But in the days following Shadow's death, whispers began to circulate, quiet at first, then growing, gaining momentum like an approaching storm. People had always known John Callahan was different, that he carried himself in a way that set him apart from the other retirees who spent their days in rocking chairs, complaining about their backs and the price of gas. He had no family, no close friends, and no interest in the pleasantries of small-town life, but there was something about him, an aura of restrained violence, a quiet sharpness that didn't dull with age. It wasn't until now, when the police had made the mistake of taking the only thing he cared about, that people began to remember why. It started with the old veterans of the town's American Legion Hall, men who had served in wars that chewed them up and spat them out, who recognized something in John they had once seen in their own reflections before time softened their edges. They spoke in hushed tones over watered-down whiskey, recalling fragments of stories that had once seemed like rumors, tales of a soldier who moved like a shadow through the jungles of Vietnam, a man whose name was spoken with reverence and fear. He had been a member of MCVSOG, an elite and secretive unit that operated deep behind enemy lines, conducting missions so dangerous they were often considered suicide runs. His code name had been Reaper, a fitting title for a man whose efficiency in the art of killing had become legend. He hadn't been just another soldier. He had been the kind of warrior who never showed up on official reports, the kind the government used when they needed something done in the dark, when deniability was more valuable than a body count. He had been trained in counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare, and silent eliminations, a man who could track, infiltrate, and exterminate without leaving a trace. And then, one day, he disappeared, slipping into the civilian world like a ghost shedding its skin. Until now, the whispers reached the younger officers at the Redford Police Department, spreading through the ranks like wildfire, filling the precinct with attention that hadn't been there before. Some laughed it off, dismissing it as the overblown war stories of old men with nothing better to do. But others, especially the ones who had been there the night Shadow was killed, weren't so quick to ignore it. Officer Gregson, the man who had pulled the trigger, found his nights growing restless, his dreams filled with the image of the old man's eyes in that moment, the quiet, measured promise he had made before walking away. There was something in that look, something that had burrowed into Gregson's bones and refused to let go, an unshakable feeling that he had just made an enemy of someone he didn't understand, someone far more dangerous than he had initially believed. Chief Rollins, a man who had spent decades playing the game of politics within the department, wasn't concerned at first. He had dealt with plenty of angry civilians, plenty of people demanding justice for something they'd never get justice for. But then he started looking into Callahan, digging into whatever records he could find, and what he found, or rather, what he didn't find, unnerved him. John Callahan's military file was heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out, whole sections missing, as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase him from history. The few details that remained painted a picture of a man who had served in classified operations, who had been awarded medals that didn't officially exist, who had spent years in places the U.S. government claimed they had never been. Rollins had been a cop long enough to know when someone was dangerous, and John Callahan was not just dangerous. He was the kind of man who only stayed quiet because he chose to, the kind who wouldn't hesitate to do what needed to be done once he made up his mind. And the worst part? They had given him a reason. While the police department scrambled to figure out exactly what they had stepped into, John sat in his darkened home, the weight of his past pressing down on him like an old, familiar enemy. He had spent years suppressing it, forcing himself to live in a world that had no use for men like him, convincing himself that he was done fighting. But Shadow had been more than just a dog. He had been John's anchor, the last thing keeping him tethered to the idea that peace was possible, that he could live out his remaining years without spilling another drop of blood. Now, that illusion was shattered, and in its place, something old and relentless stirred in his chest, something he had buried for decades. He sat in his garage, surrounded by the remnants of his past, a trunk filled with military gear, a collection of knives and firearms that hadn't seen the light of day in years. His fingers traced the edge of a combat knife, the weight of it familiar, the feel of it in his hand waking up muscle memory that had never truly faded. His mind moved like it used to, calculating, planning, dissecting the situation with the cold efficiency of a man who had once been the perfect predator. They thought they had silenced him, that they could take what was his and walk away without consequence. But they had miscalculated. They had taken from the wrong man. The official report regarding Shadow's death was filed with a disturbing efficiency, reduced to a few impersonal lines on paper that stripped away the weight of what had truly happened. An aggressive animal was neutralized after presenting a threat to officers during a routine stop. The document read, a bureaucratic erasure of the reality that had unfolded on the quiet street of Redford that night. Officer Gregson, the man who had fired the fatal shot, sat stiffly in the briefing room as Chief Rollins addressed the situation, his voice carrying the weight of authority but none of the substance of justice. We're treating this as an unfortunate misunderstanding, the chief said, his tone clipped, pragmatic. We've got enough going on without drawing unnecessary attention. It's a dog, not a person, and Callahan isn't the type to make a real fuss. The other officers murmured their agreement, some nodding, others indifferent, their focus already drifting to the next item on the agenda. But Gregson wasn't convinced, and neither was Rollins. Not really. The unease that had settled in the pit of their stomachs since that night hadn't faded, and despite the chief's assurances, the air inside the station carried a quiet tension, as though a storm was waiting just beyond the horizon. And then the phone calls began. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Angry citizens calling to express their outrage, complaints that could be ignored with the usual placating words about protocol and department policies. But soon, the voices grew louder, more insistent, more demanding. Local news outlets caught wind of the incident, and though the initial reports were mild, the veteran community was not. Men who had served in uniform, some who had known John in passing, others who simply understood the unspoken bond between a soldier and his dog, took to social media, calling for accountability. The backlash wasn't just from the old men at the Legion Hall. Younger veterans, those who had fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, joined the outcry, flooding the department's email inbox, calling the mayor's office, making it clear that this wasn't something they would let slide. It was the kind of attention the Redford Police Department didn't want, and Rollins knew they had two choices: admit fault and discipline Gregson, or push back hard enough that people lost interest. He chose the latter. The narrative began to shift. John Callahan was painted not as a grieving man, but as an unpredictable recluse with a violent past. Old records, the few that hadn't been buried under layers of classified seals, were dug up and twisted into something sinister. Articles appeared in the local paper, subtle at first, suggesting that Callahan had struggled with adjusting to civilian life after his military service. The whispers about his past, once shared in awe among the town's older residents, were repackaged into something more insidious. Stories of a man who had seen too much, done too much, a man who might not be stable. A smear campaign was set into motion, small but effective, meant to erode the sympathy the town had begun to show him. And then they came for him directly. It started with an unexpected visit. 2 officers knocking on his door in the early evening, their posture casual, but their eyes sharp, wary. "Just checking in," one of them had said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We know things have been tough lately, and we just wanted to make sure you're doing okay." John had stared at them for a long moment, his fingers resting on the edge of his doorframe, his body a wall between them and the home they clearly wanted an excuse to search. He knew exactly what this was, an intimidation tactic, a way to remind him that he was being watched, that they weren't going to let him stir up trouble. He could smell it on them, the same stench he had encountered countless times overseas, authority wielded not to protect, but to control. "I'm fine," he had replied, his voice calm even. "You sure?" The other officer had pressed, his eyes scanning the inside of the house, looking for something, anything, that could be used against him. "Last thing we want is for you to do anything reckless." The threat was unspoken, but it was there, hanging in the air like the scent of gunpowder before a shot was fired. John didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't give them anything to latch onto. He simply held their gaze until they shifted uncomfortably and stepped back, forced to retreat without justification. But he knew they would be back, and he knew they wouldn't stop. They were trying to break him down, to make him feel cornered, like an animal with nowhere to run. But they had made a critical mistake. They had forgotten who they were dealing with. John wasn't an animal, and he sure as hell wasn't cornered. He had spent years studying human nature, understanding how men operated under pressure, knowing exactly how to dismantle them piece by piece. He had done it in the jungle, had watched enemies fold under the weight of psychological warfare before a single bullet was ever fired. He knew fear better than they did. He knew how to wield it. They had taken his dog. They had covered up. They had come to his doorstep, believing they could silence him with pressure and paranoia. But all they had done was give him a reason to stop holding back. That night, he sat in the dim glow of his kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence as he spread out the information he had gathered. Notes, addresses, schedules, everything he had quietly observed about the men responsible. Every weakness, every vulnerability laid out before him like pieces on a chessboard. The hunt hadn't begun yet, but it would. Soon. They had thought they could erase what they had done, bury it under red tape and bureaucracy. But John Callahan knew how to deal with men who thought they were untouchable. He had done it before, and he would do it again. John Callahan had always been patient, a trait carved into him through years of survival in a war zone where a single misstep meant death, where the difference between predator and prey was measured in inches and seconds. He had no intention of rushing what came next. He wasn't going to kick down doors or storm the police department in some reckless act of vengeance. No, that wasn't how this was going to be played. They had made the first move, and now, piece by piece, he was going to dismantle them, not just physically, but psychologically, until the weight of their own fear crushed them. He started with the simplest thing, information. Every war began with intelligence, and this was no different. He tracked their schedules, noting when Officer Gregson left his apartment in the morning, when he arrived at work, when he stopped by the same corner store every evening to buy a six-pack he thought no one noticed. He watched Chief Rollins from a distance, learning his routines, the way he parked in the same spot outside the station, the way he always adjusted his tie in the reflection of his car window before stepping inside. He studied Officer Davis, the one who had stood next to Gregson that night, the one who had tried to play diplomat, the one whose hands had trembled slightly even though his voice had remained steady. They were men who believed they held power, men who had convinced themselves that their badges made them untouchable. But John had seen real power before. He had stood in the presence of men whose very existence had been erased from history books, men who could make entire villages disappear overnight without leaving a trace. Compared to them, these officers were nothing but amateurs playing a game they didn't understand. The first real strike came subtly, almost imperceptibly, but with precision. Gregson, already on edge from the growing rumors about Callahan's past, came home one evening to find his apartment door slightly ajar. He hesitated, heart pounding as he reached for his gun, pushing the door open inch by inch, scanning the small space for signs of an intruder. Nothing seemed out of place until he stepped into his bedroom. His police uniform, the one he always hung neatly in his closet, had been laid out on his bed, perfectly arranged, except for one small change. His badge, usually pinned to his chest, was missing. In its place was a single bullet, an old military-issue round, balanced carefully on the fabric like a signature, like a whisper in the dark that said, "I was here." He searched the apartment frantically, checking every corner, every shadow, but there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had broken in. The locks were intact, the windows sealed. And that was the point. John wanted Gregson to understand that doors, locks, and walls meant nothing to a man like him. He wanted the officer to feel the weight of his own vulnerability, to know, without question, that he was being watched. The paranoia set in almost immediately. At work, Gregson found himself looking over his shoulder, snapping at his colleagues, growing more irritable by the day. He started sleeping with his gun on his nightstand, flinching at every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside his window. And John wasn't done. The next to feel his presence was Officer Davis. Unlike Gregson, Davis wasn't a fool. He had suspected from the beginning that Callahan was dangerous, and now, those suspicions had turned into certainty. One evening, as he stepped out of his car in his driveway, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He turned sharply, scanning the darkened street, the silent houses, but saw nothing. Yet the feeling didn't leave him. His gut twisted, instincts screaming at him that something was wrong. When he stepped inside, he nearly missed it at first. His coffee table, normally cluttered with mail and loose change, was empty, except for one item. A single photograph. His own police ID photo, taken from department records, printed out and placed neatly at the center of the table. He stared at it, his throat tightening, his pulse hammering in his ears. There were no words, no threats scrawled across it. Just his own face staring back at him, a quiet reminder that he was marked, that he had been chosen. The psychological warfare spread like a disease through the department. Little things, small but deliberate, started happening. Rollins found his office chair adjusted when he arrived in the morning, his desk drawers slightly misaligned, as if someone had gone through them and put everything back just enough to leave doubt gnawing at the edges of his mind. Security footage from the station's parking lot glitched for exactly 7 minutes one night, long enough for nothing obvious to happen, but just short enough to make the chief wonder. Whispers spread among the officers, hushed conversations in the hallways, rumors of Callahan's past growing darker with each retelling. Some dismissed it, clinging to the illusion of control, but others, those who had seen the look in Callahan's eyes that night, weren't so sure. And then, John escalated. One evening, Gregson stepped out of the station and froze in place. His car, the one he had parked just hours earlier, sat exactly where he had left it. But the tires had been deflated, not slashed, just emptied, as if someone had taken their time, done it carefully, deliberately. And, resting on the windshield, tucked neatly under the wiper, was his badge, the same one that had been taken from his uniform. Except now, it was bent, warped slightly, as though it had been held in someone's hands, twisted just enough to remind him that he was being played with. He staggered back, breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he yanked the door open and climbed inside, locking it instinctively, as if that could protect him from something he couldn't even see. The other officers noticed. They saw the change in him, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way his hands clenched around the grip of his gun a little too tightly, the way his shoulders stiffened whenever someone mentioned Callahan's name. The once cocky, eager young officer who had been so quick to draw his weapon was now unraveling before their eyes. And John? He watched it all unfold from the shadows, from the quiet corners of the town where the streetlights didn't reach, where he could observe without being seen. They had underestimated him. They had thought they could erase what they had done, that he would grieve, get angry, maybe even lash out in a way that would justify taking him down. But that wasn't how this war was going to be fought. This wasn't about rage. This was about control. And piece by piece, he was taking it back. The town of Redford was changing, though most of its residents didn't know why. There was something in the air, an unspoken tension that had begun to creep into the fabric of daily life, like a storm gathering on the horizon, just beyond sight but impossible to ignore. The police force, once confident, once certain in its authority, had begun to operate differently. There were fewer patrols at night, fewer officers willing to linger in their cars alone, fewer men who spoke about Callahan in anything above a whisper. The ones who did were met with silent, uneasy glances, as if saying his name too loudly would summon something from the dark. And in a way, it already had. The campaign of psychological warfare that John had unleashed was no longer just a rumor among the officers. It had become a sickness, infecting them, spreading through their ranks with quiet precision. Officer Gregson, the man who had fired the shot that started all of this, was unraveling the fastest. He no longer slept in his bed, but on his couch, too paranoid to let his guard down in his own home. He had replaced his apartment locks twice, installed a second deadbolt, and yet he still flinched at every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. His hands, once steady when gripping a firearm, now trembled when he reached for his morning coffee. He had started making mistakes, small ones, at first, but noticeable. His reports were sloppy, his focus shattered, his judgment clouded by fear. The man who had once carried himself with the arrogance of untouchable authority now looked over his shoulder in grocery store aisles, jumped at shadows in his rearview mirror, and woke up gasping for breath in the middle of the night. He wasn't alone. The fear spread through the ranks, seeping into the bones of the department like a slow-acting poison. Officer Davis had started carrying his sidearm, even when off duty, something he had never felt the need to do before. His wife noticed the way he sat at the dinner table, his back always to the wall, his eyes flicking toward the windows more often than toward his own family. The younger officers, the ones who hadn't been involved in Shadow's killing but had witnessed the fallout, began talking about transfers, about getting out before whatever was happening got worse. And still, no one could say for certain what it was. There had been no direct threats, no physical violence, nothing they could point to and call a crime. But they knew. They felt it in the way the world around them had shifted, in the way their confidence had eroded, in the way their power had been stripped from them piece by piece, not by an army, not by an uprising, but by one man. Chief Rollins, the one person who was supposed to be in control, was losing his grip just like the rest of them. He had spent decades mastering the art of departmental politics, of covering things up, of making problems disappear before they ever reached the public eye. But this was something else entirely. He sat in his office late at night, the glow of his desk lamp the only thing illuminating the walls around him, staring at the paperwork in front of him with a growing sense of helplessness. He had ordered an internal review, hoping to put Callahan under scrutiny, to find something, anything, that could justify an arrest, but the background check came back with nothing but dead ends and missing files. The records that did exist told him what he already knew, that Callahan was dangerous, that he was trained, that he had been forged in a war where survival meant becoming something more than human. He had consulted the department's legal advisors, considering the possibility of bringing Callahan in on some trumped-up charge, but the risk was too great. A wrongful arrest could blow up in their faces, could bring national attention to something that was, for now, still contained within the town. And yet, doing nothing wasn't an option either. The men under his command were beginning to fall apart, and he knew that if something didn't change soon, they would lose whatever control they still had left. Then came the night that changed everything. A call came in just past midnight, an urgent distress signal from one of the department's senior officers. It was Davis. His voice on the radio was panicked, breathless, the kind of tone that sent adrenaline surging through even the most seasoned cops. I need backup, he stammered, the sound of shuffling in the background. Someone's inside my house. Dispatch responded immediately, sending units racing toward Davis's suburban home. But by the time they arrived, he was standing in his living room, his hands shaking, his gun still clenched in his grip, pointing at nothing. The door had been locked, the windows unbroken. There was no sign of forced entry. And yet, Davis swore that he had heard something. A presence in the dark. Footsteps that didn't belong. A breath too close to his ear. He had fired 2 rounds into the shadows before realizing that whatever had been there, if anything had been there, was already gone. The responding officers exchanged uneasy glances, none of them saying what they were all thinking. This wasn't a criminal. This wasn't some random break-in. This was Callahan. And the worst part? He had done nothing. No stolen items, no threats, no physical harm. Just an idea planted in their heads, an idea that had grown into something unstoppable. And that was more terrifying than anything else. Rollins knew, then, that they were already past the point of no return. This wasn't something that could be solved with arrests, with legal pressure, with the weight of the badge. Callahan wasn't playing their game. He had forced them onto his battlefield, one where their rules didn't apply, one where fear was a weapon sharper than any bullet. And he wasn't done. In the days that followed, Rollins found an envelope on his desk, unmarked, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No words, no threats, just a grainy, black and white photo from decades ago of a younger John Callahan in full combat gear, crouched in the jungle, a rifle in his hands, his face streaked with war paint. A ghost from the past, a reminder of what they had awakened, a warning. And for the first time in his long career, Chief Rollins felt something he had never expected to feel. Powerless. The night of reckoning arrived in silence, creeping into Redford like a shadow slipping through the cracks, unseen but inevitable. The police department was in shambles, its foundation corroded by fear, its officers rattled to the point of paranoia. Chief Rollins had done everything in his power to regain control, holding emergency meetings, increasing patrols, even considering an appeal to state authorities. But it was too late. Control had already shifted hands, and it now belonged to a man who had never wanted it, but had been left with no choice. John Callahan had spent his life avoiding conflict, burying the part of himself that had once thrived in it, but they had dragged him back into the only world he had ever truly understood. And tonight it would end. He had planned every step with the precision of a man who had once operated behind enemy lines, where a single miscalculation meant never coming home. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. This was about justice, about balance, about making sure the men who had taken from him understood the weight of their actions. The Redford Police Department, once a fortress of arrogance, was now a house of glass, waiting for the right stone to bring it crashing down. And John had that stone in his hand. The first to go was Gregson. John had watched him spiral, had observed how the once confident officer had turned into a nervous wreck, jumping at every sound, every flicker of movement in the dark. The young cop had tried to drown his fear in alcohol, had started sleeping with his gun under his pillow, but none of it had helped. Fear was a disease, and John had made sure Gregson was infected beyond saving. That night, Gregson came home to find his front door ajar again, just like before, but this time he didn't hesitate. He stormed inside, gun drawn, his breath ragged as he moved through the small apartment, flicking on lights, checking every room. But there was nothing, no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no movement, just the suffocating quiet of his own paranoia. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead, trying to convince himself that he was losing his mind, until he turned toward his bedroom and saw the dog collar. Shadow's collar, sitting neatly on his pillow. Gregson dropped his gun. His legs gave out before he even realized he had collapsed onto the floor, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he stared at the collar, his mind unable to process how it had gotten there. He had never touched the dog's body. He had barely looked at it after pulling the trigger. But now, here it was, a relic of his mistake, a message from the ghost he had created. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers barely functioning as he dialed Rollins, his voice a desperate, broken whisper. "He's here," was all he managed to say. But by the time backup arrived, Gregson was already gone, his gun still on the floor, his front door swinging open, his car missing from the driveway. They found it 3 miles away, parked on the side of an empty road, engine still running. No sign of Gregson, no blood, no struggle, just an open door and the endless dark beyond. And John Callahan was nowhere to be found. The department went into full panic mode. Officers called in sick. Others requested emergency leave. Rollins, realizing the situation had spiraled completely out of control, made the call he'd been trying to avoid since the beginning. He contacted state authorities, begging for reinforcements, for federal intervention, for anyone who could stop the thing that had taken root in his town. But the response was slow, bogged down in bureaucracy, and in the meantime, the walls continued to close in. That was when Rollins received his own message. It wasn't a phone call or a cryptic warning. It wasn't an email or a news report. It was far simpler. When he entered his office that morning, he found his chair turned away from the desk, facing the window, and on his desk, laid out with careful precision, was a folder. His own personnel file. Rollins frowned, his pulse quickening as he reached for it, his fingers hesitating before flipping it open. The first page was normal, his name, his rank, his years of service. But the second page made his breath catch in his throat. It was a list. Names, dates, amounts. Records of payments, of cover-ups, of every instance in which he had used his position to manipulate the system, to protect himself, to protect his officers. Things that had been buried deep, things that should have never seen the light of day. And attached to the final page was a single note, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Leave. He barely heard the knock on his door, barely registered the voice of one of his officers telling him that Gregson still hadn't been found, that Davis had just resigned effective immediately, that half the department was considering doing the same. He was too busy staring at the folder, at the weight of his sins laid bare in front of him. He was too busy realizing that John Callahan had just handed him a choice. He could stay and face the consequences, watch as his career crumbled, as the world found out what kind of man he truly was. Or he could do the only thing left to him. That night, Rollins packed a bag. He left his badge on his desk. And by morning, he was gone. The department, left leaderless, collapsed under the weight of its own rot. Investigations were launched. Scandals uncovered. Officers either quit or were dismissed, their power stripped from them just as easily as they had once wielded it against others. Redford changed. The people who had once whispered John Callahan's name in fear now spoke it with something closer to respect. And as for John himself, he was never seen again. Some said he disappeared into the mountains, back into the solitude he had once cherished. Others believed he had left town entirely, slipping away into the world like the ghost he had always been. But those who had truly known him, those who had seen what he was capable of, knew the truth. He was still there, somewhere, watching, waiting, and no one would ever make the mistake of taking from him again. Up on your screen, you've got two special stories. If you enjoyed this, you don't want to miss any of these two. Just decide which one you want and click.